Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the Springs Calvary Chapel. My name is Jeff. I have the privilege of getting to introduce our guest speaker. And as we were talking about asking William to come out, Julie and I, it seems like every day we would be talking about what's going on and just open up the newspaper or the news feed and shaking our heads. And every day we're saying, this is a spiritual battle. Amen. So I wanted to start with Ephesians Chapter 6, starting in verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of the world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Therefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, where you shall be able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereto with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. Will you bow your hearts with me as we pray for the service? Dear Jesus, we just thank you for this glorious day, the glorious sunshine. We thank you for the many blessings that you provide. We just ask that you would be with us tonight, that your presence would be felt, that you would speak through William, that you would open up our ears to hear and our hearts to understand. And we just ask you here today. We pray these things in Jesus' name, and all God's people said, Amen. So I've had the pleasure of spending the week with William, and I can tell you we are going to be blessed tonight. He is certainly a mighty man of God and doing the Lord's work. I'd read his bio, but it would take up the entire time that we have. So I'll just do a brief introduction. William Federer is a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and president of AmeriSearch Incorporated, a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. Bill's American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America and on the internet. His Faith and History television airs on the TCT network on stations across America via DirecTV. He's a prolific author, and when they said that Wednesday, as I was unloading his books and had to carry them around, I definitely understand what prolific means. So there's plenty of material that's available for purchase. I would encourage you to pick up some things. But what I love about it is every page that you turn, you're digging through nuggets and gems of information, and it's just it's precious information. But I think that most importantly, I've gained a new friend. And so I'd like to ask William Federer to share with us tonight.
Thank you, Jeff and Julie, and I want to let you know how much I'm impressed with your pastor, Mike Yost, and his wife, Cheryl, right? And we got a chance to hear all the stories of what the Lord has done with them in the Philippines and all over, and wow, you have a tremendous pastor right here. I'm so very, very blessed. Join me in thanking the Lord for your pastor. Yeah. Well, I send out a daily email called American Minute, and you can sign up on my website, which is AmericanMinute.com. And I have a, let's see here, there's the website. And tonight I'm going to talk about the book Socialism, the real history from Plato to the present, how the deep state capitalizes on crises to consolidate control. And I do have a flash drive with about a dozen of my presentations on it as videos, as MP4 files, so you can watch them on your computer, since DVDs are beginning to go out of style. And well, with that, let me jump in. Now, Plato lived 380 BC in Athens, Greece, and he writes, why do we talk about him? He's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And it sounds great until you think it through. Somebody is in the government handing out all this common stuff, and they're always going to be tempted to give a little bit extra to their family and friends on the side, and hold back from somebody they just don't like, and before you know it, it gets discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. And so every attempt at everybody owning everything equally winds up with a deep state bureaucracy that's in charge of handing it all out, ruled by the most corrupt politician at the top, and you have a dictatorship. Well, Plato, 380 BC in Athens, and he writes in passing of Atlantis, this highly structured civilization on an island that sinks in the sea. And whether it existed or not, he thought that it did. And he actually dates it as about 800 years before him. Right? So he's 380 BC and 800 years before that. Now there is an island in the Mediterranean called Santorini. And it's what's left of a volcano. And I actually visited it in college. It's this nice little Greek town along the edge of this volcanic crater. And when it blew up, it would have sent a tsunami across the Mediterranean, wiping out lots of civilizations. But Plato considered Atlantis the ideal structured society. Everybody say structured. And Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. Everybody say unstructured. Demos means people, krasi means rule, so in a democracy the people rule, and the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. And then they begin to tolerate people that are a little bit off. And then they begin to tolerate people that are a lot off. And then Plato says the state is like a bazaar at which you could buy anything, like a piece of embroidery with the greatest variety of human natures. Such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder. And so then they begin to tolerate disorder in their personal lives. The manner of life is that of Democrats. Now he's describing a democracy. He says every man does what is right in his own eyes. So they're tolerating everybody doing anything. And the father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son in fear, the son having no shame or fear of his parents. So they're tolerating disrespect in the home. The teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise their masters and tutors, so now they're tolerating disrespect in the classroom. And then they begin to tolerate financial irresponsibility, and they vote to take the money from the city treasury and spread the wealth around. Now the treasury's empty. And then it's democracy, they vote to take the money from the rich people. And he says the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people, so now there's no rich left. And then they tolerate immorality in their personal lives. It says the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. He's parted company with all shame. Yes, that's what he's talking about. Matter of fact, a study was done by an Oxford anthropologist named J.D. Unwin, and he wrote a book in 1934 called Sex and Culture. And he observed 80 major civilizations, including Athens, over 5,000 years of recorded history. And he saw trends. And one of the trends he saw was that sexual promiscuity and loosening of sexual restraints always precedes civilizational collapse. And so he said that civilizations go through 4 stages. The first is a period of pain and poverty. They go through war, they go through famine, they survive, and they work hard. And they work together. And they end up becoming productive and patriotic. And then they finally become prosperous. And they want to enjoy their prosperity and have a little pleasure, and then they get promiscuous and indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, and weakened, and conquered by the next rising civilization. It's sort of like an athlete. When he's young, he's focused and disciplined, watches his diet, exercises, he wants that championship. And finally he gets it, he wins. and he's the champ for a couple seasons, and then he gets a little lazy, doesn't exercise as much, eats a little fatty foods, and he gets challenged into the ring of competition. And in his mind, he still thinks he's the tough guy. But in reality, he's a couch potato and he gets the tar knocked out of him. And so civilizations go through that same cycle. Now, J.D. Unwin is not a Christian to my knowledge, but he called it a sexual marketplace. He said when women as a whole say nothing happens unless there's a commitment, the guys say fine, they make the commitment, they go out and work hard to make their wife happy, and then little kids appear. And the guy has another emotion of being protective of his wife and family. And when all the men of the country are productive and protective, rising water floats all boats. The whole country becomes productive, protective, innovative, creative, expansionistic, even militaristic. But when the women say there does not need to be a commitment, water seeks its own level. And you'll have a bunch of guys getting pleasure-focused, hey, selfish, and focusing on their own selves, and there's fewer kids born to fill the ranks of the military. When enough of the men of the country act this way, the country gets weakened. And that's when they get conquered by the next rising civilizations that's still at that militaristic phase. And J.D. Unwin says it's irreversible. In observing all these civilizations, once they start going down the hill of sexual promiscuity, it's like a snowball that gains momentum. Why? Because human nature is on its side. It wants that pleasure. And so he says that it's irreversible and the civilization will collapse. And we're faced with the attempt to try to slow it down and reverse it. But John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy? Intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly. No effort in favor of virtue is lost. Here it is, Truman worded it this way, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So, Athens, they tolerate each other. That's nice. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off. Till finally they're tolerating lawlessness. And there's random violence and crime and insecurity and people getting robbed. And then the people begin to look around for someone to fix this unstructured mess. And that's when some governor comes along and he says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. Just temporarily, just some emergency powers. And then Plato says, last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's a protector. He's full of smiles. Hey, I met him. He's really nice. And then he begins to consolidate his power, right? Because he wants to fix this mess. And it says, if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he'll have a good pretext for destroying them. How does the protector begin to change into a tyrant? He begins to grow unpopular. So tyrants have two tools in their toolbox, fraud and force. Fraud is they will lie to you and take away your freedoms, telling them that they're doing it for your own good. But then when you begin to see through it, you begin to want to confront them. And they begin to go down in popularity. And they have a choice. Give up the power, which they're not inclined to do, because Plato called them a lover of power. Or they'll get rid of the people confronting them. And they purge their administration and their military of anybody that has virtue, anybody that has morals. All they want is yes men. And once they purge the military of anybody with morals, they use the military to force their agenda down the throats of everybody. And Plato says, standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, a tyrant absolute. And then having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood, so he stirs up the mob to attack his political enemies. So, Plato said democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on the people having virtue. And people really don't have virtue. If you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. Now, ancient Israel's attempt to rule themselves without a king, they were virtuous a little bit longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. And the people were virtuous because they were accountable to God. Athens did not have that. By Plato's time, Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And so he said, this democracy thing's based on virtue, and people are going to give up their virtue. It's just a matter of time until the satellite, like this gravity pulls the satellite back down to Earth until this thing crashes. Plato even said, if someone was born that had virtue, the world would crucify him. This is what he writes in 380 BC. If a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. He wrote that 380 BC. So, Plato concluded that the best you could hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. And if we give him the benefit of the doubt, let's say there is such a thing as a nice tyrant. I mean, every now and then you get a good king. And he wants to concentrate power so he can do good more efficiently. But he doesn't live forever, and at some time he has to hand all that power over to some son and grandson who's not a good ruler, but likes the power, and he begins to use it oppressively. So that's the dilemma. We get our guy in, and we say, hey, it's okay that he usurps a little bit of power because he's pushing our agenda, but what happens is the next party's going to be in control, and they're going to use that concentrated power to push their agenda. What's the Bible example? Joseph in Egypt, a godly man, concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what did that Pharaoh do with the concentrated power? He fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land in Goshen, gave him jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And he used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel and even make them throw their sons in the Nile River. Right? So that's the dilemma. Every now and then you get a good guy in there and he concentrates power, and so he can do good more efficiently, but then he hands it off to the other side. Plato says that since democracy is doomed to fail, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He's the head of gold. And his administrators and military are the arms and chest of silver. Together they make up the ruling class. And they can live a little bit better in a little bit better houses because they're the ones that are keeping everything organized, and they're the ones busy handing everything out, and everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze. They are the ruled class. So socialism is a structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. Now, the ruling class, they're above the law, they're politically connected, they're supported by the commoners, they can do special things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. I remember Nancy Pelosi that was. The ruled class. Yes, everyone is provided for, but nobody owns anything. Everything's held in common, right? And the ruling class decides who gets what. And so it's he that holds the purse strings has the power. Plato writes that there are no families in his perfect society. The government decides who gets to have children. And then the government takes the children away from the parents and brings them into the city where they're socialized, which is a process of getting them to give up their family's values and adopt the values of the ruling class and to serve the ruling class. Plato says that when the true philosophers, kings, are born in a state, they will set in order their own city, right? Set in order. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws, right? And then these kids will be taught lies, noble lies. Plato said, we want one single grand lie, which will be believed by everybody. But the lie helps the king to stay in power, and since he's the best you can hope for, because democracy is doomed to fail, that's okay to lie to all these kids. Could you imagine the government taking the kids away from the families and bringing them into schools and teaching them lies to keep the ruling class in power? Anyway, Plato's perfect society on the island of Atlantis inspired in 1516 Sir Thomas More's Island of Utopia. So this is shortly after Columbus discovers America, and these scholars in Europe are saying, gee, maybe we have an opportunity to set up perfect societies in the New World. And so the word utopia means nowhere. It's a fictitious island somewhere off the coast of South America, supposedly discovered by Amerigo Vespucci. And on this island of nowhere is, it's written as a dialogue. That's the way Plato wrote. It's a conversation between two people. One asks the question and the other answers. And so the Utopia of Sir Thomas More, it's a dialogue with someone named Hyphlodeus, which means peddler of nonsense. So we have the island of nowhere told to us by the peddler of nonsense. And on this island of Utopia, it is perfectly structured. There is upper class rulers and lower class commoners. There's free health care. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's free meals in monastic communal dining halls. Everyone lives in identical 3-story public housing. There are no locks on any doors. There's no private property. All property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse, with the ruling class deciding who gets what. There's no taverns, no ale houses, no coffee houses, no places for private gatherings. There's no privacy. Everyone is tracked everywhere you go with an internal passport. Without it, it's a lifetime of slavery. Can you imagine that? 15, 16, he's talking about everybody being tracked. The government decides everyone's careers, that you have to work the rest of your life. There's no families on Utopia. The government regulates childbearing. Very similar to China's one-child policy or Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger, who said no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. Now, Sir Thomas More wrote this as a veiled criticism of Henry VIII, because he's the king that switched from Catholic to Protestant and told all of his staff they had to immediately switch with him, and Sir Thomas More didn't want to switch, and Henry VIII had him killed. So Plato's Island of Atlantis, Sir Thomas More Island of Utopia, inspired Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. He names it New Atlantis because he's directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. And in this New Atlantis, it's a fictitious island in the South Pacific. Highly structured, ruling class, commoners, more scientific careers because the scientific revolution is going on at this time. But the government dictates everything. Someone wrote a satire on this, and you've read it. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Right? Here's Gulliver, which means gullible traveler, like Hyphlodeus, and he's washed up on an island and finds out it's highly structured with a ruling class that controls every minutia of everybody's life, and then the ruling class that just has to work their jobs and do what they're told. Now, why is this important? The Pilgrims. So the Pilgrims had no money, and they went to investors in England, and they formed the London Company, and had bylaws for the company. And the bylaws for the Pilgrims said, all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain still in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel, and all provision out of ye common stock. Well, the Pilgrims tried it and almost starved to death. Governor of the Pilgrims, William Bradford, writes, the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. I just think this is amazing, that the Pilgrims knew that they were trying to live out Plato's perfect society. This is the governor of the Pilgrims, and he's writing this, and he talks about the emptiness of the theory of Plato. He says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men, who were most able and fit for service, objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man, who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men, who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc., with the humbler and younger ones, thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Bradford goes on, let none argue that this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn, obtain a better crop, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want. After much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. You plant corn for your household. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. Right? So we have this theoretical Plato's or Thomas More's or Francis Bacon. Hey, I got an idea. Let's have everybody own everything in common. And the Pilgrims, they're the first ones to actually try to live out this theoretical stuff. And they almost starve to death. They scrap it. They give everybody their own plot of land, and they become successful. And we have days of Thanksgiving to remember that. Now, wasn't the early church socialist? Well, no, actually, the early church was the early church. Socialism is counterfeit early church. And the differences between the word, voluntary and involuntary, and church and government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their land and laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to distribute. They didn't have the government taking their land away and then be forced to involuntarily lay the money at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. Here, Pilate, here's a little more money for the Roman government. No. When the children of Israel went into the promised land, every family was given property. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. And you can be moved upon in your heart to give away some of your stuff. The Bible called that charity. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase from capitalism to communism. Capitalism empowering the individual, communism empowering the state. Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. So if you don't own property, how can you be charitable? How can you give away what you don't have? What, are you going to steal from somebody else and now you're a thief? You broke the law? No, God entrusts you with stuff, and then you have the voluntary opportunity to manifest on the outside the love of God that is in your heart. Does that make sense? Now, wasn't Jesus socialist? Jesus taught the parable of the talents. And one guy got 5, multiplied it to 10. One guy got 2, multiplied it to 4, and one guy buried it. And he said, "Sir, here is your talent. I kept it laid away in a piece of cloth." His master replied, "You wicked servant." He said to those standing by, "Take his talent away from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. "Sir," they said, "he already has 10. He replied, "I tell you that everyone who has more will be given, but as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away." If Jesus were a socialist, he would have said, take from the guy that has 10 and divide them up equally. Instead, he said, take it from that lazy guy that's never done anything with it, and give it to the guy that's going to do something with it. The hand of the diligent shall bear rule. Right? The word paraclete for the Holy Spirit means helper. You don't sit back with your feet on the couch and say, Holy Spirit, do it. No, you get out there and do it, and the Holy Spirit helps you. But you've got to do something. And God blesses you when you do something. Right? Now, there's confusion as to roles. In the Bible, God clearly gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. Commands to individuals, among other things, include helping the poor. Family commands are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, submit to your parents. Business commands are do an honest day's work, don't hold back the wages. The church definitely has commands to take care of the poor, and historically they did. Feeding the widows and the orphans, and starting hospitals and medical clinics, and digging wells in villages. And I was talking to Pastor about their ministry in the Philippines, and Larissa about the ministry in Rwanda. And the Christians were always doing things, right? Do you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor? The command to the government is the shortest. Protect the innocent, punish the guilty. Right? And defend the borders. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. Historically in America, you had the Second Great Awakening revival in the early 1800s. And you had preachers like Charles Finney, who said, being a Christian is more than just going and hearing a sermon. You got to do something. And so his lectures on revival were read by someone named George Williams over in England. And he decided to do something. He started the Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA. Another couple in England read Finney's lectures on revival, William and Catherine Booth, and they started the Salvation Army. And you had groups starting abolitionist societies to free the slaves. You had temperance societies to cut back on drinking. You had women's suffrage. You know, Clara Barton was a school teacher, and she started the Red Cross. You had individuals, right, in churches starting programs and taking care of all the domestic needs without the government's help, right? In the early 1900s, you began to see like Woodrow Wilson saying, I want to encourage everyone to donate to the Red Cross. But it wasn't the government doing the work. It was telling the government, saying, give to the Red Cross. But these were individual organizations and church organizations. It all changed with FDR and the Great Depression and the New Deal programs and the government coming in and saying, we'll give out money, we'll do this, and it created a dependency, but it usurped the church's role that traditionally took care of all the social needs. And then it got even worse with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society welfare state. And so now, a generation and a half has gone by, and the church forgot that it ever did all that stuff. But if you do some digging, 8 of the 10 largest hospital corporations in America were started by churches. Mostly the Catholic Church, but then the Baptist, Seventh-day Adventists, Lutherans, and so forth. And most of the universities were started by churches, right? And anyway, James Madison says, charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government. Davy Crockett was a congressman before he died in the Alamo. And there was a fire in Washington, D.C., burned a bunch of Georgetown. And Congress was going to take some federal tax money and help the people in Georgetown rebuild. And Davy Crockett said, no, Congress has not the power to appropriate this money as an act of charity. Every member on this floor knows it. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to appropriate $1 of public money as charity. Calvin Coolidge says, it does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. We need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. We need to take care of the immigrants. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. We need to start schools. Yes, we do. We need to feed the poor. We need to start schools for the poor. We need to do all that, but it's not the government's job. And prior to FDR, the government didn't do it, the churches did it. And individuals would get an idea and they would start a little organization, right? Somebody would start the Boy Scouts and somebody else would start the Girl Scouts. Everybody would start organizations without the government. Gerald Ford said, people say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? Now what if older fish could tell younger fish to stay away from shiny things dangling in the water? But they can't. So every new generation of younger fish sees that shiny fishing lure and they're caught. Socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free clothes, free education, free welfare. Free is attractive, but there's a hook there. You're giving up your independence. You're giving up control of your life. Now, whenever the church helps anybody, it is called disinterested benevolence. You're helping them just to helping them, expecting nothing in return. And if they get better off, then hopefully they can help the next needy person that comes along. Whenever the government helps anybody, it's always in exchange for something. Right? You're in Egypt, you need food, and the government says, we'll give you food, but it's in exchange for your cattle, your land, your children, your lives, your votes, right? When the church helps, it's personal. The giver feels the joy of the Lord, of God using them to meet the need of a person. And the recipient feels the love of God through a real person. And they're grateful, and a relationship is established, and they end up building the body of Christ. Whenever the government helps anybody, it is always impersonal. You don't know whose pocketbook that money came out of that turned into the welfare check that you got in the mail. And you really don't care. And instead of being grateful, it becomes a debt that is owed, and if it's delayed, the recipient gets irate. And then, over time, the recipient begins to lose self-esteem. They see other people working and being successful, and they know they're just relying on this check, and they begin to feel bad about themselves. And they want to channel that bad feeling somewhere. They want to blame somebody. They end up blaming the very government giving them free stuff. They end up hating the very government giving them free stuff. It's a strange dynamic. So back to the Pilgrims. They switched from company to covenant, which is a switch from involuntary to voluntary. So instead of your neighbor being taken care of because the bylaws say that all the stuff's going to be taken care of and somebody's going to distribute it, what happens is voluntarily the Lord entrusts you with stuff, and then you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. This is called a covenant form of government. And the Pilgrims and Puritans got the idea from ancient Israel. And it's like a triangle. You get rights and blessings from God, and you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. It's all voluntary. Voluntary is sort of a big deal with God. You know, when you think about it, He makes everything, and everything follows rules. Right? Laws of planetary motion, laws of gravity, laws of optics, and little puppy dogs, they're following instinct. I mean, you know, and all the animals, everything follows what they're programmed to do. And God's like, okay, you know, been there, done that. I want to make somebody that has free will. Right? We have the choice. And so free will is sort of, so He has the Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness. And He says, whoever's heart is moved can bring stuff to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. So they bring purple cloth and gold and all this kind of stuff. And then finally they say, okay, wait, we have enough. But it was voluntary. And then David is collecting stuff for his son Solomon to build the temple. And he gets 3,000 talents of gold, and he gets the leaders together and says, what are you guys going to give? And they pitch in 5,000. And then he says, God, everything we have is yours. We're just giving back to you what you gave to us. But it's voluntary. God wants to build His temple voluntary. It says in Psalms 110, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. Right? So He's really into building His kingdom through you voluntarily yielding to Him and letting Him do His will through you. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, are addressed to each and every person. This is the origin of the sanctity of the individual. Your founding fathers came over with that. They looked after one another, not only as a matter of necessity, but as a matter of duty to their God. No other country in the world started that way. Well, there was one other country, and it was ancient Israel. So, America, you have the pastors in New England, and they study the Bible, and they study, in particular, that first 400-year period when Israel came out of Egypt, before they got King Saul. It's called the Hebrew Republic, and it was the first time in world history where you have a nation with millions of people and no king. Right? For 400 years, they didn't have a king. You don't appreciate it until I spent several years, and I wrote about it in some of my other books, where I studied every single century of recorded human history. Writing of records began around 3300 BC with Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Right? Today that's Iraq. And from that time on, you have kings. Pharaohs, Caesars, Kaisers, Sultans, Tsars, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, and they keep getting bigger because with military advancements, the king can kill more people. Until finally the King of England had the biggest. He was a globalist, a one-world government guy. Sun never set on the British Empire. And America's founders decided they didn't like this globalist king telling us what to do, so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. Where did our founders get the idea from? The New England pastors. Where did they get it from? The Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before they got King Saul. And so, matter of fact, they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. This is Yale's coat of arms. It still has, to this day, Hebrew characters on it. Truth and light. So here's Israel. Everyone in Israel is taught the law. Everyone's given private property and so forth. And so if you think of power, government power, as a line. One side is total government, the other side is no government. Total government, you get a king. He rules through fear. You do what he says or he kills you. The other side is no government. That would be anarchy. Unless the people have virtue. What's virtue? That's where they all have internal morals. And like in Israel's case, they're all taught the Ten Commandments. I was trying to think of a way of explaining it. Imagine if everyone downloads a behavioral app on their iPhone. Instead of a GPS app telling you where to turn, imagine a behavioral app, right? Now, where do you go? And you download it. And the Levites were the computer geeks that help you to download this app. Right? And so you've downloaded this app, you have it on your phone, and it's sensing your blood pressure, and it sees that you're with somebody, and it can hear the volume on your voice, and it sees that you're about to lose your temper and blow it, and then yell at the person, and it says, alert, alert, don't lose your temper. Right? And then this app checks your bank account, sees it's getting a little low, and sees you're in a store with lots of expensive stuff because it knows all the prices, and it sees there's nobody else in the vicinity, and you're looking a little bit extra too long, and it runs this algorithm that you're being tempted to steal it, and it says, alert, alert, don't steal. So imagine you're carrying around this behavioral app with you. And so that's what the law was. For ancient Israel, everybody was taught the law. And the Levites were the computer geeks that helped you to download this app. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel had the key ingredient. There's a God who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. You're about to steal, nobody's around, you know you can get away with it, and then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair, he's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. Maximum liberty. Women can go anywhere without fear. You don't have to lock anything. I mean, everything. Because everybody thinks, okay, I want to be fair. God's watching me. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Okay. Now, God knew the Israelites would sin. And rather than them walk around the rest of their life with a guilty conscience, once a year they had the Day of Atonement. And everyone's sins in the whole country were forgiven for the past year, and they start off the new year with a clean slate. And this is foreshadowing Jesus. He is our atonement, not just once a year, but once forever. He died on the cross to pay for our sins, and we approach this perfect God through the Lamb. Ronald Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. If there's no God, laws are just made up by a bunch of old men. Why follow them? Yeah, some will as long as it's socially acceptable, like Plato, as long as everybody's got virtue. But then some people are going to realize, hey, I can steal, I can, right? And then before you know it, turns into lawlessness. So ancient Israel's situation was, they had the priests, the priests stopped teaching the law. You said they did? Yeah. And then once they stopped teaching it, then it turned into this chaos. And so you got Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. I mean, you're the high priest not even teaching the law to his kids. And then you have the Levite with a graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. And the tribe of Dan comes along and steals the graven image and tells this Levite, come along with us. You can be a priest to our whole tribe. And you're reading the story saying, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them? Right? So the Levites weren't teaching the law. And then this terrible story, the Levite with the concubine. And the law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is, he's with a woman he's not even married to, so he's not following the law. And they're in a house, and the house is surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the very last stages of a people ruling themselves, right? This casting off of self-restraint, abandonment of passion. Remember J.D. Unwin said that one of the last stages, sexual promiscuity always precedes civilizational decline. And so then you read this line in the Bible, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priest had stopped teaching what was right in the Lord's eyes. Right? So this is almost the exact same line that Plato used. Now Plato was about 600 years later. Right? So this is around, 1000 BC, and Plato was around 300 or so BC. So what happened? Ancient Israel turns into an unstructured mess. And the people begin to say, can't some governor come along and fix this mess? And they go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, the self-government system's not working anymore. We want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. Right? And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they have not rejected thee, but they've rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And so they get a king. Now the people said, we sinned, right? So then a storm comes, lightning destroys their crops, and the people said, we sinned in asking for a king. And they said, yeah, you did sin, but God will still work his plan of redemption, which he did. Well, let's look at another story. So Saul is now the king, and he is pouting that his son Jonathan became friends with David. And he turns to his soldiers, and he goes, none of you soldiers care about me. And one soldier, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I care about you. I saw David go to this town, and the priests gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. And Saul says, bring those priests to me. The priests show up, and Saul tells his soldiers to kill him. And the soldiers hesitate. And Doeg the Edomite says, I'll kill him, goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system, where everybody's accountable to God and follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you kill anybody. There's only one witness, Doeg. So the soldiers are hesitating. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. Right? You tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. Tell me there's no more marriage. Whatever the government tells me, I'm just a bunch of bush. Right? And so whenever the government, a dictator comes in, a tyrant, he wants to insert himself between you and God. He wants to dictate morality to you. And God's jealous. He doesn't want somebody between you and him. And anyway, so the pilgrim got their idea from ancient Israel, the idea of a covenant where you get rights and blessings from God, and you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you personally are accountable to God. I'm going to go through 3 more slides, and we can see the transition of covenant to social contract to socialism. So, century after the pilgrims, covenant turns into social contract during the Age of Enlightenment. And this comes out of the scientific revolution, where you have Sir Isaac Newton discovering laws of gravity, laws of optics, Kepler discovering laws of planetary motion, Robert Boyle discovering laws of pressure. And so some theologians said maybe God made everything with laws. And like a guy makes a clock and winds it up and sets it on a shelf and goes off for a walk. Yeah, maybe God made everything, but he's not involved. He's distant. He's impersonal. The ultimate of this is God is an impersonal force in the universe, right? And so we go from pilgrim covenant with a personal God to the Age of Enlightenment social contract with a distant God. Next century, it's social contract with no God during the French Revolution. You get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group. Social compact, right? And the next century it turns into Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. So, let's go through the pilgrims to the social contract, Age of Enlightenment, to the French Revolution. So let's look at the French Revolution. You have a king named Louis the 16th. He's nice. He sent his navy to help us win the Revolutionary War. Well, after the Revolutionary War, you know what France got in return for helping us? Nothing, but debt. And then their crops failed. And then the people didn't have bread. And they go to Queen Marie Antoinette. She says, let them eat cake. She just grew up in court. She didn't know what was going on. Anyway, so the people of France thought if they could just chop off the king and queen's heads, all of their problems will be solved. And so they chop them off, and it doesn't get any better. So then they chop off the heads of all the royalty, and it doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of all the wealthy. You have money, we don't, you're selfish. You must have gotten that money the wrong way. And then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers, and it doesn't get any better. You got food and supplies, we don't, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra food, we don't have enough, you're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy, because they're speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. Somehow they're to blame. Then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. They even invented a nice clean machine to do it with called the guillotine. Do you know what the motto of the French Revolution was? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty, it sounds nice, except it doesn't work. Liberty is experienced individually. Fraternity is their word for socialism. It's the fraternity, the club, the collective, the group, the mob, the state. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternity, the group, the collective, thinks you have too much stuff, it can use the power of the state to trample your individual liberties, take away all your stuff, redistribute it, and kill you. So the rights of the collective always overrule the rights of the individual. So it sounds like a nice thing, but there really isn't any liberty. And so when this is going on, and they're chopping off all the heads in Paris, in America you have Timothy Dwight, and he's the president of Yale, and he says, you know, prior to our revolution, we had a Great Awakening revival, but prior to the French Revolution, they got rid of God. He says about the year 1728, Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. The being of God was denied and ridiculed. Possession of property was pronounced robbery. You got property, you got stuff, you must have taken it from somebody. Chastity, natural affection were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices. Right? So here we're back into the promiscuity. Adultery, assassination, poisonings, and crimes of other like infernal nature were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. So it's okay to smash windows of people with stores if you're pushing your agenda. And then Timothy Dwight talks about France, the education of youth, books replete with infidelity, irreligion, immorality, and obscenity. To destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God. In other words, we first have to get rid of people thinking about God, then you get rid of the law, then it turns into chaos, and then the rubber band snaps into the hands of a king. So we have this model. Democracies and republics are based on the people having morals and virtue. But they give up the morals and virtue, it turns into chaos, and out of that chaos, they want somebody to come along and fix it, and the rubber band snaps back into the hands of the king. Right? Now in France during this time, it's called the Reign of Terror, they tear down statues. Like they tore down the statue of good King Henry IV. He's the guy that tried to patch up Protestants and Catholics. And then they dig up the bones of St. Genevieve. Here is, who is she? 450 AD, Attila the Hun, with an army of 500,000 men, is wiping out city after city in Europe. And he's headed toward Paris. And Genevieve gets everyone in Paris to fast and pray. And for some reason, Attila skips sacking Paris. So she's considered the patron saint of Paris. During the French Revolution, they dig up the bones of St. Genevieve and trash them. Why would you do this? Why do you want to destroy history? It's called deconstruction. And it's, every conquering country does it, where you portray the founders of a country negatively so that people emotionally detach from them. And then you get people in a neutral position where they're open-minded, and then you give them a pitch positively for whatever future you have planned for them. It's a sales technique. So if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently brushing with. You're still brushing with that stuff? Haven't you read that it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? Ooh, you're repulsed by it. Now I have you in a neutral position, you're open-minded, what are all the toothpaste out there? And then I give you my pitch for this brand new target control breath freshening toothpaste, right? So it's a drive neutral reverse. It's a gene replacement therapy for a culture. Take out the old identity, put in the new. And so that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians, they sold people into slavery, they were chauvinists. Forget the fact that they gave you a country where you're in charge of your life. And these kids are like repulsed by the founding fathers. Now you got the kids in a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them your pitch for LGBT or socialism or Sharia. Right? And this is what happened in Europe. So Europe went from 1,000 years of Catholic cathedrals and Protestant Reformation and Jewish neighborhoods to a secular Europe with the French Revolution, free sex, anything goes, and now it's turning into Sharia socialist Europe, with Mohammed being the #1 name for newborns. And yeah, the government pays for everyone's education, but the government determines your career. Right? If you are a kid and you score bad on a couple tests, the government channels you into career paths. You get a little older, you decide, hey, I want to really be a doctor. I'm going to study real good. So sorry, you can't go that way. You scored bad on this test. Well, but I really want to try. No, you can't. And I've known people that have grown up in Europe, and they at first weren't applying themselves, and then they later wanted to, and it was shut off. There was no funding. They were not allowed. So, French Revolution. So they're chopping off all these heads, and they wanted to erase Judeo-Christian influence. And so religious monuments were destroyed, graves desecrated, religious meetings prohibited, churches closed, Christian schools banned, church education outlawed, no public or private worship allowed. They even killed nuns. The nuns did the hospital stuff. The oldest hospital in Europe is called the Hotel Dieu, and it's right next door to Notre Dame Cathedral. It was started in 660 AD by Christians. And so these nuns started so many hospitals that the nun hat turned into the nurse's hat. You know, the nurses used to wear that little hat? That came from the nun's habit. And so the nuns were like the most, even Florence Nightingale, who was the lady with the lamp during the Battle of Crimea in the 1850s in Europe. You know, she's a pioneer of nursing. She said there's no training for a healthcare better than that of a Catholic nun. Right? So it was sort of synonymous. She got it done, she did healthcare. But it was a bit more convalescent type infirmary stuff, but nevertheless they did it. Well, during the French Revolution, they wanted these nuns to give up their Christian faith, and they wouldn't. So they lined them up to the guillotine, and they were singing their church song, and they would chop off their heads. And there'd be one less person singing. Then they would chop off some more heads. Less people singing. Then they finally chop off the last head, nobody else is singing. Could you imagine the government, like, when they were pushing through Obamacare, that these little sisters of the poor who had taken vows of chastity and they didn't want to support abortions, and they had to go to the Supreme Court twice. Right? Here they are saying, you got to give up your religious convictions. So during this time, you have Robespierre, and he's the head of their French Assembly. I apologize, this keeps slipping here. He said, lead the people by terror. Basis of popular government during a revolution is terror. Terror is nothing more than swift, severe, inflexible justice. Could you imagine the government terrorizing its own people? Wow. So this time, Robespierre, by the way, every day he'd come out with a new list of people to be investigated for being disloyal to the new government, right? The new administration. And he'd sort of have a list of names, and they would go out and round up those names and chop off their heads. And then he'd come out with another list of people to be investigated. We need to have it. We need to detain them. We need to put that. They were involved in an insurrection. We need to lock them up. And priests and ministers, those who harbored them, were executed on sight. So even if you were caught housing a pastor, a similar thing happened in Mexico in 1917. Then there's a rural area. They're way out in the country. They're far away from the capital. They think they're safe. It's called the Vendee. And 300,000 are killed by this federal army that comes into town. Men, women, and children. It's considered the first modern genocide. And it became the model for every socialist revolution since. Kill off the old order so that you can do your new liberty, equality, fraternity, right? Matter of fact, Robespierre put a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with a sheet, said this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. They don't even want done in the year of the Lord, like our Constitution. So they make 1792 the new year one of the Republic. They don't even want a 7-day week because it goes to the Bible. So they come up with a 10-day week. Each day had 10 hours. Each hour had 100 minutes. Each minute had 100 seconds. They said 10 was the number of man because you count with 10 fingers. So they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. So during this time, there's no God. It's just the mob that this guy decides who's going to die today, who's not going to die. And so there's no right, there's no wrong. It's just the mob. And out of this mess, you get Napoleon. Right? So democracies and republics where the people don't have morals and virtue turns into chaos. And out of that chaos, people want someone to come along and fix it. And you get a dictator. Well, in France's case, the dictator was Napoleon. And now Napoleon conquers across Europe, 6 million die, and afterwards the king of Prussia said we can't get conquered that easy again, we need to strengthen the state. And so the king of Prussia gets a philosopher named Hegel, who teaches at the University of Berlin. And I'll tell you about him in a minute. So we go through these 4 slides, right? So we got covenant with a personal God, social contract with an impersonal God, and then French Revolution, a social contract with no God, to Marxism and socialism where the state is God. And so Hegel said the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. Rousseau, who wrote the social contract, said when the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. So the state decides your worth. 100 years later in Germany, says Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. And then you have Pol Pot, communist Cambodia, kills 1/3 of his own country. He says, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. Your life is only valuable if you help me get power. So again, Pilgrim Covenant, Age of Enlightenment, distant God, French Revolution, no God, socialism, state is God. Hegel said the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? Like the 10 Commandments? Yeah, the state doesn't acknowledge any limits. It's just a power grab, and if you help the state grab power, the state thinks your life is useful to it. And if you challenge the state's power, it'll use its power to crush you. Matter of fact, this is what, during the Nuremberg trials, when they were prosecuting these Nazis for killing Jews, the Nazi officer said, we were just following the laws of our state. And the state's the highest power. And our state said that it was okay to kill them. And here the prosecutor's like, no, there's a power higher than the state. They're trying to figure out, how do we say it? Eisenhower said, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The Founding Fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make their revolutionary experiment make sense. In other words, do your rights come from the government or do they come from the source higher than the government? Right? If our founders said our rights come from God, and therefore the government's job is to protect and guarantee to you your Creator-given rights. But if there is no Creator, your rights come from the government, the social contract, right? The collective, the group, the mob, the fraternity. And what the government giveth, the government can taketh awayeth. Eisenhower said it's because all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. we claimed that the king was infringing on our God-given rights, and therefore we were justified in breaking away from the king. Well, now, that's the first part of my book, right? And so the title of the book is Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And the subtitle is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control. And it's very interesting, and I'm going to get into it, but I didn't know if you want to take a break for a few minutes to use the restroom and maybe look at the books on the table. Would you like to do that?
Yes.
All right, so we'll do that for a few minutes and then maybe come back in 10 minutes. Is that all right? Did you get anything out of this? Well, great. Well, did you get anything out of that first part? Did it make sense? Talking about Plato, the French Revolution, and, so in this second part, I'm going to talk about the subtitle of my book, and that's How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control. So democracies and republics are attempts to take the power of the king and give it to the people. So democracy only really worked on a citywide level, where demos means people, crossing means rules. So there's 6,000 citizens in Athens, and everybody has to be at every meeting every day to talk about every issue. And if you're not there, you're called an idiotus. So true democracies could only get as large as a city because logistically everybody couldn't be there every day. Republics, they can get larger because you can take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to market every day. They're your representative. So the REP in republic is the same REP in representative. And now what if the king wants the power back? Does the king just go to the people and say, hi, I want to be king, give me control of your life? Oh yeah, here you go, king. Is that how it works? No. So there's two ways that the king can take the power back. One is fear. When people are afraid, they'll trade freedom for security. And the other is free stuff. And so let's look at these two. A drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He can come in with guns and shoot people and they get in fear, or the drug dealer can give away free drugs and get everybody hooked. And then he says, oh, you want some more free drugs? You're going to sell yourself into prostitution, right? It's like a hunter can get animals through guns or bait. Right? One is the gun, right? Or the other is to trap them. You know, I was reading How to Catch Pigs in the Wild. Down in Texas, some of these southern states. And the first thing you do is you put a post in the ground and throw some corn down. And then the pigs come and ignore the post and eat the corn. And then you, next day, have two posts in the ground and throw the corn. Next day, three posts and four posts, and start putting them in a semicircle. And then you start putting the fencing in between. And the pigs come, and they keep ignoring all that, they just eat the corn. And then finally, one day you shut the gate, and you caught yourself some pigs, right? And so the two scriptures are, fear of man bringeth a snare. So when a snare means trap. So when you're in fear, you will be trapped. And then free stuff, the scripture, but every man when he's tempted is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So your lust can entrap you. And so we see the deep state, big government creates or capitalizes on chaos and discord. And then in the atmosphere of fear, promises a solution to free stuff. And in the midst of that, they take control of your life. Now, how do you create fear? Well, you have to sow discord. And so the scriptures are Psalms 133, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Everybody say unity.
Unity.
And then Proverbs 6, 6 things the Lord hates, and the last is he that soweth discord. Everybody say discord.
Discord.
So we have unity, we have discord. Now imagine somebody sowing discord in heaven. Well, that's what Lucifer did, got a third of the angels to rebel. And then he's cast down and he sows discord in the garden. And he has Adam blame Eve, and he has Cain kill Abel. And then he sows discord in Israel. And let's look at that first 400-year period before they got King Saul. There was Gideon. And he defeats 100,000 Midianites. So there's no threat to Israel. It's at peace. But then Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech. And Abimelech sows discord because he wants to seize power. So what does he do? He goes to the town of Shechem, and he's the first one on record to do critical race theory or identity race politics. He sows discord. He goes to the men. Is it better for you that all the sons of Gideon reign over you? remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his brothers spake of him in the ears of all the men of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow him, for they said, he is our brother. So he's identifying with them based on the flesh, not whether or not he can do a good job of ruling. And then he goes to the city treasury, the temple of Baal-berith, and he takes money to hire rioters, Antifa type people, right? BLM type. And he says, and they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons would follow him. And they went to his father's house at Ophrah, and they did violence. They slew his brethren. And then the men of Shechem made Abimelech king. Right? So there's peace. It's a peaceful country. And then he goes there and he begins to sow division, right? And us versus them based on a fleshly thing. And then he takes money and hires rioters, and they do violence. And in the violence, he seizes power. Now, Israel's republic would have ended here rather than a century later with King Saul had not someone threw a millstone over the wall and killed Abimelech. Well, but let's look a little bit closer to our time period. Machiavelli lived in Italy 500 years ago. And Italy's a bunch of city-states. Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena. And they're always fighting. And Machiavelli thinks if one prince can control all of Italy, it will stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop all the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city, and the city doesn't want to be conquered, it would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, smash windows, sort of like Abimelech paid vain and worthless persons, the people will panic in fear, and they'll want someone to come along and fix this mess. And then the prince can come along, get rid of the very criminals he bribed to create the mess. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house, set it on fire, then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on the crises to consolidate control. Rahm Emanuel put it this way: you don't ever want a crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do important things that you would otherwise avoid. Or Hillary Clinton: I'm actually excited about this opportunity, this crisis. The chief of staff of President Obama is an old friend of mine, my husband's, and he said, never waste a good crisis, and that's what we're trying to do. Fox Primetime: Ben Dominic's The Authoritarian Left is using the permanent pandemic to achieve as many ends as they can imagine. This is Rahm Emanuel's famous dictum: never let a crisis go to waste. Normal times don't produce the outcomes that the authoritarian left wants because the people are not scared enough to give them the limitless power they crave. Crises are necessary. So if there aren't any on offer, they manufacture them. So you and I see a crisis, our response is, how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, their response is, how can they usurp power through it? Henry Louis Mencken wrote in 1956, the urge to save humanity is almost always a false face for the urge to rule it. Ronald Reagan said, one of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism is medicine. It's a healthcare crisis. It's easy to disguise a medical program as a humanitarian project. What's he talking about? It's called seizing the moral high ground. And casinos do it. If a casino wants to move into an area and the area doesn't want it, they'll cite statistics of crime going up. But if the casino can give some money to schools, they can seize the moral high ground and claim that they care about the children. And if you care about the children, you will support casinos. And if you're not out there campaigning for more casinos, you must hate the children. It's called virtue signaling. They want to present themselves as more caring than you. And so what Ronald Reagan is saying, this is what they do with it. It's easy to do this with healthcare. Saying we care about people's health, and unless you surrender your body to the state, you must hate the children. You must hate your grandma. You must hate your neighbor unless you give us complete control over your body. And here's an editorial cartoon, Daily Caller, scientists looking through a microscope saying, it appears to be mutating into a totalitarian dictatorship. Reagan, if you don't stop this, behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom until one way we will awake and find we have socialism. Now, the response to usurpation is resistance, and every individual must say no. We used to have federal politicians resisting for us. We were trusting them to hold back the floodgates of hell. But when a certain individual certified, which I don't think he did, because the word certified means to make certain, and certainly didn't make certain, but the umbrella was ripped, and suddenly, instead of all that rain being held back from us, it's now pouring down on every one of us. And it's up to every female athlete to push back. It's up to every student to push back. It's up to every pastor to push back. It's up to every sheriff to push back. It's up to every single one of us. It's up to us to push back, because those that we were trusted to push back didn't. Well, we're talking about Lucifer creating discord in heaven, right? We talked about the devil creating discord in the garden, Cain killing Abel. We talked about Abimelech sowing discord. We talked about Machiavelli sowing discord. Let's look at the British Empire. The British Empire became the biggest empire on planet Earth. 13 million square miles, 500 million people, all these countries. Do you think they just walked into a country and said, hi, we are going to be the biggest empire on Earth, so give us control of your country? Oh yeah, here you go. Is that how it happened? Let's look at how they took over India. They first landed in Bengal in 1714 and opened a trading post that turned into a trading fort, that turned into them having guns and giving guns to one kingdom and guns to another kingdom, and then stirring up ancient animosities between the kingdoms, sowing discord, until it broke out in warfare. And these kingdoms are fighting and bloodying each other up, and then when they beat each other up really good, the British would come in to restore order. And they would take control of both kingdoms. And then they would do this again and again and again until they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. They tried doing that in America during the Revolutionary War. And so General Johnny Burgoyne lands in Canada, comes down and meets with the Mohawk Indians in New York, and promises them money for scalps. And they go out and begin to scalp Americans. And it's even in our Declaration of Independence, lists all these reasons we're rebelling against the king. And one of the things listed in our declaration is the king has excited domestic insurrection among us, has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Right? The Indians knew on and off. They were at peace, they were at war, right? And they didn't know any in between. And when it was war, it was total war. War of 1812. British controlled Pensacola, Florida. And north is Fort Mims, Alabama, and the Red Stick Creek Indians. You know the French pronunciation of Red Stick? Baton Rouge. Right? Baton, stick, and rouge, red. And so, like Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So, the British go to the Red Stick Creek Indians and promise them money for scalps. And so they capture Fort Mims, Alabama, and then the 500 people they captured, they went and scalped them all. And so this is the historical marker. Here, Creek Indian War, 1813-14, took place the most brutal massacre in American history. Indians took the fort with heavy loss and killed all but about 36 of the some 550 in the fort. Creeks have been armed by British at Pensacola in this phase of the War of 1812. Do we really think the British Empire cared about the Red Stick Creek Indians? No, they were wanting to stir up this division so we would fight each other, and then they could have an excuse to come over and take control of all of them. Washington warned of this in his farewell address. Disorders, discord, and miseries will gradually incline the minds of men to seek security in the absolute power of an individual. We want some governor to come along and fix this mess, who turns the disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Washington warns, let there be no change by usurpation. What's usurpation? That's where I'm going to take away some of your freedoms, but I'm doing this to help you. And you let the political leader usurp some power because he's telling you that he's doing it for your good. Encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, thus to create whatever the form of government, a real despotism. Washington, usurpation, though in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. What's he saying? This is his farewell address. He's giving you a warning. He's saying, watch out in times of disorder and miseries and discord.
of some leader coming along wanting to do an instrument of good. Right? I want to do something good that we need. It's an emergency. I want to do something good. I'm going to take away usurp some of your freedoms because I want to do something good. And Washington says it's the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. That's how you destroy a free government. Some leader coming along saying, I want to do something good. I just need a little power. Right? I don't have time to wait for Congress. I got my pen and my phone. I mean, you know, Washington, usurpation must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any transient or temporary benefit which the use can't at any time yield. So no matter what temporary benefit it's going to do, it's going to cause permanent evil. So we're studying about in times of crises, power concentrates. So let's look back at Europe. And Napoleon conquers, and afterwards the King of Prussia said we can't let that happen again, and he gets his philosopher Hegel. Hegel teaches at the University of Berlin. He's got a student named Karl Marx. Marx is a member of the Young Hegelians, a radical student group. And Hegel influenced Darwin's theory of evolution, right? The species, and then they comes up with the, you know. Anyway, so here's your Hegelian dialectics. It's a triangle. One corner is a thesis. The opposite corner is an antithesis or antithesis. And the top corner is a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. Marx says, okay, the thesis is the status quo. It's the way things are right now, and everybody's used to it, and everybody's sort of getting along. You have to create an antithesis. In other words, you have to create a problem that is real bad. You have to sow discord. And then when it gets bad enough that people will panic in fear and be willing to trade freedom for security. And that's when you usurp power and the people settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And then that becomes the new starting point, and you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody gives up some more of their freedom to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. Then you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody will give up some more of their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And every time they settle, rights and powers are going from the individual into the hands of the state. Now, Karl Marx says, well, how do you create a problem that's real bad? You have to send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers, and their job is to seek out people with grievances and stir them up to riot. And when it gets bad enough, everybody panics and wants some governor to come along and fix it, and they let their power get usurped. And so, Karl Marx called this critical theory, where you would observe all the groups in a country, economically, religiously, ethnically, doesn't matter, and you would call some victims and others oppressors, haves and have-nots, and you would pit them against each other. And so at first it was critical economic theory, and you would pit the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners. You'd pit the poor against the rich, the blacks against the whites, the Catholics against the Protestants, the Muslims against the Christians, the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. They really didn't care who the two sides are, and they really don't care what the issues are. Their goal is to stir up domestic crises so everyone panics in fear. And they begin to beg for some governor to come along and fix this mess, and they're willing to let the rights and freedoms get usurped in the name of doing an instrument of good. You know the Congo and Rwanda? The people there saw themselves as one. But the German and Belgian, you know, later French and English colonizers would measure their features and would categorize them as Hutus and Tutsis. They literally created racial distinctions that had not been there before. And they encouraged them to fight each other and even genocide each other so that the colonizing power could come in and take control of both. Could you imagine the government breaking people into groups just to pit them against each other so they can seize more power? So, Castro said the revolution needs the enemy. The revolutionary needs his antithesis, which is the counter-revolutionary. And if enemies were lacking, they had to be fabricated. In other words, you can't organize your people against something if there's nothing there to organize against. So you need an enemy. And if there are no enemies, you create them. White supremacists, all this kind of stuff. You create something out of nothing because you have to organize against something. You have to get people into fear. Jesus said, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. That's Satan's strategy. You cause division inside of a marriage, division inside of a family, division inside of a church, division inside of a country. You Patriotism's the enemy, you get people to identify with subgroups, and you pit the subgroups against each other until they riot. And if people are raised seeing everybody as one, you've got to go into the schools and get them to no longer see everybody as one and begin to see divided into different groups so that it's easier to pit them against each other and create the division. It's like an autoimmune disease to the body politic. What's an autoimmune disease? That's where your own body attacks itself. Your own immune system begins to attack your own organs. That's the strategy. You want to get the body politic to attack itself from the inside. And so FDR said, whoever seeks to set one nationality against another seeks to degrade all nationalities. Whoever seeks to set one race against another seeks to enslave all races. So-called racial voting blocks are created of designing politicians who profess to be able to deliver them on election day. FDR, 1942. Remember the Nazi technique: pit race against race, religion against religion, prejudice against prejudice, divide and conquer. Charles Barkley, NBA player, CBS Sports, April 3rd, 2021, said, "Man, I think most white people and black people are great people. I really believe that in my heart. I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they be Republicans or Democrats, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. We're so stupid following our politicians, their only job is, hey, let's make the whites and blacks not like each other. Let's make the rich people and poor people not like each other. Let's scramble the middle class. I truly believe this in my heart." Malcolm X, 1963, said, "The white liberal differs from the white conservative. Both want power. But the white liberal has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor, to use the Negro as a pawn or a political weapon in this political football game, and the white liberal controls the ball." Now, how did this begin to come to America? 1894, Chicago, Pullman Railroad Car Company. And they have an economic downturn and they can't pay their workers what they used to. So the workers have grievances. And somebody comes along to organize people with grievances. His name is Eugene Debs. Bernie had his picture on the wall of his office. Anyway, Eugene Debs organizes them to protest and riot and to commit violence. And they destroyed $80 million worth of railroad cars, and it spreads to 27 states. And since everything in the country shipped on railroads, the whole nation is paralyzed. Could you imagine people organizing riots that go from one city to another, just paralyzing the whole country with things burning? Eugene Debs then formed the Socialist Party of America, and he ran for president 5 times from 1900 to 1920. One time he ran for president from prison. And then in 1920, branching off of the Socialist Party USA, is the Communist Party USA. And the Communist Party runs candidates for president every year from 1920 to 1940. What happened in 1940? That's when Franklin Roosevelt makes a treaty with Stalin during World War II. And the Communist Party USA says, why should we run our own candidates when here we have a Democrat president making treaties with Stalin, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? And that's when they began to infiltrate that party. Ronald Reagan even talked about it. He says, I didn't leave the Democrat Party left me. Right? Former pro-life Democrat Senator Zell Miller. I met him years ago before he died. He said, unfortunately, the National Democratic Party has been taken over by the very liberal, left-wing leaning special interest groups in Washington. I mean, he's a Democrat senator saying his party's been taken over. Now, lest we think that all they want is one party, Democrat Congressman Albert Herlong, 1963, reads into the congressional record the 45 goals and tactics of how the communists plan to take over America. One of them is capture one or both of the political parties. Resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. Do away with loyalty oaths or pledges of allegiance. Go back to Germany. 1920s, Germany was a republic. The people voted, right? And they had someone start a party called the National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazi. And the leader of it was Hitler. And the party had an under-the-table violent arm to it, sort of like Abimelech hiring vain and worthless persons, sort of like Machiavelli, right, where the prince would hire people to do crises, and sort of like the British stirring up crises. And so Hitler's group was called the Brown Shirts. and they were nicknamed Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers, because they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and disrupt the meeting and shout down the speakers. And then they would lock arms and block access to public buildings. Could you imagine people locking arms in public and blocking things? And then they blocked streets. And then they went into the cities and they smashed the windows, looted and set on fire over 7,500 stores owned by Jews in the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. And then their capital got set on fire. And evidence points to Hitler's own people setting fire to it, but Hitler blamed his political opponents and decided he's going to do investigations, decides he's going to start arresting them, so he's going to start rounding them up. And he puts them in jail and he shoots them without a trial. And when the dust settled, Hitler did not have any political opponents left, and Germany transitioned from a republic, bottom up, to a dictatorship, top down. Stalin did a similar thing in Russia. 1934, he faced a growing anti-Stalinist movement. At the same time, he had a popular supporter named Sergei Kirov, who was the party boss in Leningrad. So Stalin had an idea. He would assassinate his friend Sergei Kirov and eliminate a potential rival and blame it on the anti-Stalinists. Nobody would suspect that he did it because he and Sergei were such good friends, and everybody would believe the anti-Stalinists did it because they didn't like Stalin and they didn't like Sergei. Stalin used that as an excuse to do investigations, to do some arrests, to round up, to lock away, and kill over 1 million people in the first Great Purge of 1936 to 38. Erdogan did a similar thing in Turkey. Right? He staged a coup. Right? He flew up in an airplane and landed and claimed that there was a coup, and he pulls out a list of 30,000 of his political opponents, has them zip-tied, taken away, and they've never been seen since. And Turkey transitions to a dictatorship. You know, Tucker Carlson showed the video of the very first people breaking into the U.S. Capitol. And they're all dressed in black with tactical gear, and they act like they know exactly what they're doing. They don't look like people that heard a speech and suddenly got riled up. And there were no group of people dressed in black at the rally. And this happened before Trump even finished his speech. And then people that were there took pictures. The doors around the Capitol have huge magnets at the top that they have to be buzzed in from the inside. Right? So these doors, there's no glass broken on these doors. These doors were buzzed in from the inside. There were people that were there that said it was cold that day, and the doors opened, and they thought that they were being let in from the cold. Somebody else thought they were getting a free tour of the Capitol. 2,300 police officers for one building? It's the most protected building on planet Earth. Nobody gets in there by accident. And then we see the pictures of Ray Epps. And the night before, he's in the crowd over and over again saying, we need to break into the Capitol. We need to break into the Capitol. Right? And Tucker Carlson brings us to the attention, and all of a sudden the FBI takes his name off their most wanted list. It's like, well, here he's on record saying break in there, and you're investigating people. And then everything points to this being an entrapment, right? A planned thing that they had planned from the inside, and then they needed a bunch of dupes to sort of like the kidnapping of Governor Whitmer of Michigan, right? They got a dozen people, and they caught half of them were FBI agents that paid for everything, organized everything, planned everything, and called a bunch of low IQ people saying, we need you to show up, we need you to be there, we need you to, these guys say, okay, I show up, and then they get, oh, we caught this plot. They planned it. And so in psychology, it's called psychological projection, or blame shifting, where the attacker blames the victim. Karl Marx says, accuse others of what you do. Little kids do this. I didn't start the fight, you did. I'm not the mean one, you are. Wife beaters do this. They'll beat the tar out of their wife, say, it's your fault because you provoked me. Or a Sharia man will rape a woman, say, it's your fault because you tempted me. And so the attacker blames the victim. And it's gotten into politics. And David Axelrod was Obama's campaign manager, and he said on NPR radio, April 19, 2010, in Chicago there was an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window and then calling a press conference to say you've been attacked. So you do the crime, but you blame it on your innocent opponent. So let's say there's a candidate running for president who's colluding with Russia, giving away a fifth of the U.S. uranium to Russia in exchange for $145 million Russian oligarch contributions to her Clinton Foundation. She wants to pay for a Steele dossier to accuse her opponent of colluding with Russia. His name gets smeared with it in the media. Most people don't think lower than the subject line. And if it ever gets pointed back at her, by that time the water's muddied. The public doesn't know who to trust, and she gets a pass. Let's say there's another candidate that's extorting Ukraine, saying, stop investigating my son, or I'm going to hold back billions of U.S. aid. You want to accuse your opponent of extorting Ukraine, right? Their name gets smeared with it in the media. If it ever gets pointed back, by that time the water's muddied, nobody knows who to trust, and you get a pass. And the investigations are simply excuses to subpoena all the evidence that can convict them and destroy it. Hard drives, laptops, servers, text messages, emails. So this is like Abimelech, right? Paying people to do the crises. This is like Machiavelli, paying people to do the crises. This is like the British Empire coming in there, stirring up the crises. Right? This is like the brown shirts creating the crises. Now let's get a little closer to home. After World War II, Germany, France, England give up all of their colonies all around the world, and they start brand new countries with brand new leaders. India becomes a country. Egypt becomes a country. Israel becomes a country. Right? Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, all these countries are free, and they elect brand new leaders. They're climbing out of the post-war crises, and it looks hopeful, except the Soviet Union decides to do critical theory. And they send their agents into the country to observe all the groups. Ethnically, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs. Economically, religiously, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox. It doesn't matter. And they would categorize them as victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And they would organize protests, escalate to riots, co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the new leader of the new country for all the problems and stir the country up to a frenzy and nurture weak links in the military. And when the country gets panicky enough because of all the crises, they do a coup or a rigged election, replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. Country after country after country fell. Eisenhower does nothing because he thinks the United Nations he helped form will bring world peace. These countries are falling so much that it got the name Behind the Iron Curtain. All these countries are now controlled by the Soviets. Now, Mao Zedong tweaks it a little bit in China. So instead of doing the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, a couple times to create the crisis and seize power, his idea was after you seize power, you still do the crises. You just keep doing crises, and you keep usurping more power and more power and more power. He called it a continuous revolution theory. So you take the land from the rich, then you take the land from the upper class, then you take the land from the middle class, then you take the land from the lower. You take the land until you get all the land, and you just keep doing crises. It's sort of like a continuous pandemic. Another variant, another variant, another variant. I mean, you want to squeeze this thing for all, so you want to milk this crisis until you can get as much rights away from the people as you can. So the next president is Eisenhower. And he says the United Nations has seemed to be two distinct things to the two worlds divided by the Iron Curtain. To the free world, it seems it should be a constructive forum. To the communist world, it has been a sounding board for their propaganda, a weapon to be exploited in spreading disunity and confusion. So Eisenhower can either do nothing while these countries continue to fall or do something. And so he decides to fight fire with fire. 1953, Iran sides with the Soviet Union. Their leader, Mossadegh, nationalizes the oil industry in Iran. And you say, big deal. Wait a second, Britain has no oil fields. So in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. Right? In 1954, they changed the name from Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to British Petroleum, or BP. But it's the Anglo-Iranian Oil. So when Mossadegh in Iran seizes all the oil assets, British Petroleum has no petroleum. And so they appeal to Eisenhower for help. And Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leaders, Operation Ajax. The CIA operative on the ground is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. And he's an expert in foreign languages. He goes to Tehran and he organizes protests. He recruits mobsters and gangsters and radical imams, and they escalate to violence, and co-opts the media with bribes and threats to blame Mossadegh for all the problems, and finds weak links in the military, and when the country gets panicky enough, they put Mossadegh under house arrest, lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they replaced him with a Shah. We loved America because we put him in. CIA did the same thing in Guatemala in 1954, the Congo, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, and the KGB did the same thing, with Brezhnev and Khrushchev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO for the purpose of sowing division in the Middle East. And Brezhnev and Khrushchev helping Castro to sow division and take over Cuba. And Brezhnev and Khrushchev helping Che Guevara start FARC in Colombia and ELN in Bolivia for the purpose of sowing division. And they had over 200 coups and coup attempts in Africa. This period of time is called the Cold War. And these tactics of going into countries, observing all the groups, pitting them against each other as victims and oppressors to destabilize the country and seize power have been perfected and perfected and perfected. The only difference this time along is they've been used on our own soil against us. And under the Obama administration, we saw what's called the politicizing of federal agencies. It's a nice way of saying the IRS was co-opted to target conservative groups. And the intelligence agencies were co-opted to dig up dirt on the president's political opponents. We begin to see that these tactics that ostensibly were used for patriotic purposes in the past in other countries to keep those countries from falling into the control of the Soviets, now those tactics have been politicized, being used on our own soil. Chris Matthews, MSNBC hardball, in his last television appearance, it was after a Democrat primary where they were talking socialism, and afterwards he says, I remember the Cold War. I've seen what socialism was like and I don't like it, okay? It's not only not free, it doesn't work. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park. Now he said something in there that they didn't like, so he was let go after this interview. Now what's he talking about, executions in Central Park? Well, Castro had an executioner named Che Guevara. And Che Guevara writes, we executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess I discovered that I really like killing. Blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier into an effective selective cold killing machine. A people without hate cannot triumph. And now let's get a little closer to home. Chicago has Al Capone, a hitman, Frank Nitti, and a young guy rode around with Frank Nitti named Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky said, gee, all that they had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood in Chicago would panic in fear and be willing to trade freedom for security to the mob. Right? This idea that you pay people to go in and create crisis and the people will surrender their freedoms. And so Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky. And President Obama worked with the Alinsky organizers in Chicago. And Saul Alinsky says the first step in community organization is community disorganization. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict. For unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. This has been the politics we've been experiencing in America for the last generation. The intentional dividing people into groups, pitting them against each other to cause division. Now, Saul Alinsky has an acknowledgement in the front of his book to Lucifer. I have a copy of the book, right? Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment, did it so effectively he lives what his own kingdom, Lucifer. Remember we started off talking about Lucifer sowing discord in heaven, Lucifer sowing discord in the garden, Adam, and Eve, Cain, killed Abel, and then sowing discord in the republic of the Hebrews before they had a king, going in with Abimelech and sowing the discord. And then we talked about Machiavelli sowing discord, so that he could have one prince conquer all of Italy. Then the British Empire, right, coming into a country and sowing discord so they could take control, and tried doing that in America during the Revolutionary War. And we talked about Eugene Debs taking advantage of the workers there in Chicago and sowing discord and organizing them to riot. Right? And then Hitler, and then Stalin, and you know, when you look at the verse in the Bible, it says, the devil takes Jesus to a high mountain, shows him all the kingdoms of the world, in a moment of time, says, bow down and worship me. I'll give you all these kingdoms because they're mine to give. I'll give you whoever I want. And Jesus says, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. But you think, that's pretty audacious of the devil to say all these kingdoms are his. When did he get them? When Adam sinned. Adam was in charge of the garden. We know that because he named everything. Naming means you have authority over. You have kids, you get to name your kids. Right? Adam named everything, he had authority. But the Bible says, to whomever you yield your members, servants to obey, to him you are a servant. The moment Adam obeyed Satan, he was posturing himself as the one taking the orders, and the devil as the one being in charge. And the devil usurped power, and every kingdom was ruled through fear. You do what the Sultan, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, here's the Sultan, Balban of Delhi, India, said fear of the governing power is the basis of all good government. So all these kingdoms are ruled through fear, top down. Unless you had ancient Israel that first 400 years, it was ruled bottom up, with people being virtuous and everybody being taught the law. But the idea of creating crises to seize power. You know, we've had a generation of rioting and crises that just spread all across the country. And they all had an element of, sort of looked like they were organized. And pallets of bricks being dropped off right where they're going to have a peaceful protest. I spoke in Emporia, Kansas. The former state rep, you know, had the whole little city, you know, little hall, and they said, yeah, somebody dropped a pallet of bricks off right here in Emporia, Kansas, right where they were going to start their peaceful protest, and there was no construction going on in the area. And lo and behold, somebody in Dallas, pallet of bricks dropped off, somebody in another. All around the country, did it happen to have pallets of bricks? Tremendous amount of organizing went into this. Where's the NSA? I thought they were monitoring everybody. Are they that clueless? Or maybe they aren't. And then there's some areas that you just can't get people to riot, so you import people from other countries that have a predisposition to rioting, to sowing discord. Now, let's look at the COVID response. The first thing was what? Let the criminals out of jail. Did you catch that? I mean, it's like, really? You couldn't think of anything else? You said, hurry up, let them all out of jail. Hurry up, hurry up. It's like, you couldn't like just transfer them somewhere? And then crime goes up. It's like, duh, you let criminals out, crime goes up. And then some people feel unsafe in the big cities and they move out. Who? Maybe families. Okay, pro-family people. They tend to belong to a particular political party. Who's left in the city? Well, maybe more people dependent on government entitlements. They tend to belong to a different political party. And then businesses are closed and looted and vandalized, and police are ordered to stand down, and police are being defunded, and so pro-business people move out of the big city. Okay, they tend to belong to that first political party. And then churches are shut down where pro-life, social conservatives gather. And then schools are closed where students that have been indoctrinated with hate America are free to riot. Who would want to organize students to riot? Remember this guy, Congressman Albert Herlong, 1963, reading into the congressional record, these communist goals. One of them was get control of schools. Use them as transmission belt for socialism and communist propaganda. Get control of teachers' associations. Put party line in textbooks. Use student riots to foment public protests. Here it is in 1963. It says we want to use student riots. Right. So the net COVID response was more people of one political party move out of the big cities, leaving the other party with monopoly control of city politics. And in elections, whoever wins the big cities ends up winning the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president's elected by electoral votes. Do you know that all they had to do was really just win 6 cities? Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Phoenix, just 6 cities. They win those cities. They somehow win the whole state, right? They wait till everybody else in the state reports, and then those cities wait, and then they report with just enough to put it over the top for the other party, and they get all the electoral votes for the whole state. And then the president's elected by electoral votes. Anyway, I just thought I'd come and give you a little encouragement tonight. So there's two ways that the king can take the power back. One is fear. When people are afraid, they will trade freedom for security, and the other is free stuff. And so, you have Karl Marx, Frederick Engels write the Communist Manifesto. And then they write this, that they are alchemists of the revolution. Their business consists in spurring it into artificial crises. Every new crisis must be more serious and more universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed. In the end, commercial crisis will lead to a social revolution. Why would you want to ruin more small capitalists? Because socialism is a two-tiered system of a ruling class and a ruled class. There is no room for a middle class. Middle class can pool their assets and challenge the ruling class, so you want to get rid of them. Lenin said you grind the middle class out of existence between the two millstones of inflation and taxation. Taxation, you just take it away. Inflation is you create trillions of dollars chasing the same amount of goods, price of the goods go up, and then people can't survive. This is a 1934 Chicago Tribune editorial cartoon, guy looking like Trotsky, writing plan of action for U.S. Spend, spend, spend under the guise of recovery. Bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure to junk the Constitution and declare a dictatorship. Spend, spend, spend. What's that? That's trillion-dollar stimulus programs that are not intended to stimulate. There's trillion-dollar infrastructure programs that are not intended to build the infrastructure. They're intended to create trillions of dollars out of nothing, chasing the same amount of goods, so the price of those goods skyrocket. And so everybody that's on fixed income is not going to be able to survive. And they're going to go to the government and say, help. And the government says, we'll help, we'll confiscate all your retirement, and we'll give you a check. And then they're going to say, oh, for you to get another check, you got to get the most recent booster. Oh, and you have to let us do facial recognition on when you file. Oh, and we somehow found out you have guns in your house. You got to give up the guns if you want to continue to get the checks. And one by one, these people that are dependent, what's their choice, right? We saw this during the Great Depression. So during the crisis, FDR, right, he begins to do all that, take control of things, and then give out money. And he ruled the country through mandates, through executive. Could you imagine a president issuing mandates? And one of them was he outlawed the private ownership of gold, just by a mandate. People were burying gold coins in coffee cans in their backyards to hide them from the federal government. And then Lyndon Johnson follows up with his Great Society welfare state. That's to intentionally get people to sign up for welfare because then you can control them. It's called the Clower-Pittance strategy. Richard Clower and Francis Pittance were socialist professors at Columbia University. And they said it's too difficult to institute socialism with tanks. Just bankrupt everybody. And so this is the strategy, right? So you get as many people to sign up, and Lyndon Johnson instituted this. And if you think of it for a moment, it's pretty effective. Imagine if you were getting a $1,000 check in the mail every week from someone you didn't know. Week after week, month after month, $1,000, $1,000. After a few years of this, would you wake up and ask yourself, who is sending me this $1,000 check every week? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office. Would anybody do that? I'd be like, well, my kid's got a couple more bills to pay. Once you get people to receive free money from you, you can pretty well count on their vote. Now, an interesting guy was Yuri Bezmenov. He was a KGB agent. And he went to India, and his job was to do critical theory. He says, people think of KGB like James Bond. He goes, no, it's a whole lot simpler. All we do is go into a country and observe all the groups. And we categorize them as victims and oppressors, and then we find the influencers of each group. In the media, in the pulpit, in education, they invite them to their socialist parties, they get them to put socialist storylines in their movies and their textbooks and so forth, their sermons, and He says this period of time takes 20 years. But he says when people go through this, it is so effective, you can take them to a concentration camp, show them, and they won't believe their eyes. He says the next is a shorter phase of the destabilizing, where you spend. Remember the guys in recovery, and you get them to bankrupt the infrastructure of the country. And then the third is a crisis that you can fan, you do an emotional frenzy around the country, and then you do your coup, or your rigged election, and you replace leader with the Soviet puppet. And now I wanted to focus on the one part where we talked about identifying the groups of the pulpit, and the infiltration into seminaries, and not just in America, but around the world. But this is what Albert Herlong, this congressman, read into the congressional record in 1963 of the communist tactics to take over America. One was infiltrate the churches, replace revealed religion with social religion. Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent 11 years in gulags, and he says, I call upon America to be more careful, prevent those from falsely using the struggle for social justice to lead you down a false road. A black man that got involved in this is Manning Johnson. He became a communist, ran for Congress in New York as a communist. And then he saw some black men wanting to build a hospital, had to be first class. And he saw the communists undermine all of their efforts. And then he saw some other black businessmen wanting to have a real estate development, and had to be first class with fountains and bridges and shops. And he saw the communists undermining their whole effort. And he finally concluded, you really don't want to help our people. You're just using us to sow division. So he left them. And he testifies before the U.S. Congress, and he writes a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt, writes the forewords of the book. He talks about, among other things, that the communists first tried to do in the minority communities what they did in Russia. Get the people to spit on the Bible and kick the Bible. But he says they couldn't get anywhere because the minority community in America was too attached to the Bible. So their idea was to change the gospel. And he says the new line went like this. Jesus the carpenter was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of that day. That is why he drove them from the temple. Communists are the modern-day fighters against the capitalists or the money changers. If Jesus were living today, he would be persecuted like the communists. So forget the gospel, that we're all sinners and we deserve to go to hell, and Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, died on the cross to pay for all of our sins. Forget that. Jesus was just an activist. But we see this infiltrating in the pulpit is continuing today. Here's a Washington Times article. George Soros and his rented evangelicals, right? Money coming in. And David Horowitz, former communist, now conservative writer, says the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. Civil rights, women's rights is never the real cause. Women, blacks are only instruments in the larger cause, which is power. Battles over rights and other issues, according to Alinsky, should never be seen as more than occasions to advance the real agenda, which is the accumulation of power. Lenin said that the people that are on the ground that think it has something to do with hands up, don't shoot, and Confederate flags and statues, people that think that that's the issue, Lenin would have referred to them as useful idiots. Because that's just a low thing. The big thing is they want to cause division to seize power. Now, you may have seen the critical race video of kids on a starting line, and the teacher says, if you're from a home with a mom and a dad, you've got a special advantage, take a step forward. And if you're from a safe neighborhood, you've got a special advantage, take a step forward. And they take a step, still, some kids are taking lots of steps forward. And the other kids are on the starting line. And they're looking at each other like, this is not fair. It's a pretty convincing video until you ask yourself, what's the finish line? Is the finish line how much stuff you can accumulate before you die and leave it all behind? Or is the finish line standing before God? And him saying, yeah, I bless you with stuff. What did you do with it? I was naked, did you clothe me? I was hungry, did you feed me? I was sick and in prison, did you visit? What did you do? Whatever you did for the least of these my brethren, you've done to me. The answer is not to teach critical race theory in the schools. The answer is to send youth pastors and evangelists into the schools to get these kids born again. Because once they receive the love of God, they're going to want to love everybody. Love your enemies. Do good to those that hate you. Bless them that curse you. Right? Critical race theory says you cancel your enemy. The Bible says you love your enemy. Right? Matter of fact, the gospel says that if you don't forgive an offense that is done against you, you will not be forgiven. Right? So if you're involved in critical race theory, harboring resentment from wrongs, guess what? You're not going to be forgiven of any wrongs you do. You know your spirit, mind, and body? Your mind is like a super fancy computer. It's more than that, but it's at least that. And your body's like the computer case, which makes it silly for people to argue over what color the computer case is. And the reds, red, and greens. So it's like, it doesn't matter what color the computer is. It doesn't matter what color your phone is. What matters is what software is running on it. It doesn't matter what color somebody's skin is what behavioral software is running on their brain. And the other side wants to put their malware and their corrupted files and their viruses on these little kids' brains. And it's our job to put the gospel behavior, on their brains. So not the CRT, but the gospel. I thought it was also interesting. Ezekiel says, the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father. The soul that sinneth it shall die. You don't make the kid pay for the sin of the parent. Critical race theory says that this little kid has to pay for the sin of some ancestor that they never knew, and their whole life they've got to pay for it, and they're always going to be a bad person. You're a bad kid and you'll forever be a bad kid. There's nothing you can do to change the fact that you're a bad kid. That's not the gospel. And anyway, and Jesus was treated the worst. He was completely innocent. He was treated the worst, and he was crucified. And what did he say? Father, forgive him. And if he is our Lord and our example, we have to forgive every offense that's done against us. Anyway, and so I could go on and on. But the first prophecy, it was God telling the serpent, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It'll bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So it happened simultaneously on the cross. So at the same time the devil thought he won, he lost. Right? The devil thought, hey, I got the Jews and Gentiles to kill Jesus, and Jesus says, it is finished. The devil's like, what's finished? The name Satan means accuser. And he accuses us to God and say, if you're a just God, you've got to judge their sin. And God says, I did judge him in Jesus. So the devil lost his job. He got his authority crushed, right? Jesus paid for all of our sins. And what I think is the same crisis that's going to cause some people, and it was simultaneous, right? The same crisis is going to cause some people to give up and deny their faith and even take the mark of the beast. That same crisis is going to cause other people to get more excited for Jesus and have a great revival. In the freshman chemistry class, the teacher has a beaker with a solution and pours in a catalyst that causes a reaction, and some stuff precipitates and gets heavy and floats to the bottom of the beaker, and other stuff gets effervescent and bubbly and floats to the top. The time period we're living in is the solution in the beaker. The crisis is the catalyst that's poured in. And some people precipitate and drop out, and they get scared, they run away, they hide, they deny their faith. And other people get effervescent and bubbly and say, God, use me. Right? The early church, when they're persecuted, they pray for boldness. God, use me. And anyway, someday you're going to be dead. It's a nice way to end the talk. And you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, no less days to sing his praise and when we just begun. Imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. You're walking the streets of gold, you meet Moses. Maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven, but Jesus said, in my Father's house are many mansions. I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. If the burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs in the fireplace. I heard one preacher say, in heaven you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife would say, where were you? I said, I was thinking about something else. But imagine being there in Moses' living room, right? Maybe it's about the size of this. And after all the small talk's over, you say, Moses, tell us the story. I read the book, I even saw it blue. But here you are in person. The room gets quiet, Moses stands up and he says, it was a crisis. Pharaoh, the most powerful leader in the world, was charging in us. We were totally unarmed, it looked hopeless. And I just held up my staff and I said, God, use me to make a difference. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to look around the room and see David. David, tell us your story. The room will get quiet, David will stand up and says, it was a crisis. There was this thug, Goliath, mocking our God, making fun of our faith, and all these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything. And I said, enough of that. Took my little sling, hit him in the head, took his own sword and chopped his head off. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to hear Gideon tell his story, and Deborah, and the Apostle Paul, and everybody's going to say, it's going to be really exciting. Then everyone in the room is going to look at you. Say, you, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story. What did you do when it was your turn to be down there? What are they saying about God in your country? Or the baby the Lord knew in the mother's womb? Or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis? Or what did you do when you were backstabbed by all your Christian friends and all you had left was just looking at Jesus? And you just had a little bit of faith like a thread, but you just kept trusting in Jesus and it turned into a string and a rope and a cord. And finally, the blessings of God came back in your life. You know, I'd hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus to walk in the room and to have, you know, him, a screen come down and him show all kinds of great things and miracles happen, people coming to the Lord, and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life, and that mountain that held you back is this little bitty anthill. The fear of man. What are people going to say? What are they going to post about me on the internet? I let that hold me back from doing all this great stuff for Jesus. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for Jesus because you're already in heaven, because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have feet that trod the soil. We still have breath in our lungs. You still can do those things that you'll be known for forever. God knows every dirty backroom deal that every corrupt person's doing. He knows all that. And he chose for you to be alive right now. He's given you his word. He's given you his spirit. He's given you a great pastor. This is your chance. You know, it's like a basketball game. Jesus is the coach. You're on the bench and he comes over and says, okay, your turn, get in the game. Slaps you on the back. And you're like, yeah, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know. It's your turn, get in the game. But coach, somebody just got knocked down. Yeah, I know. You're 7 feet tall. They're 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. Yes, there's crises. Yes, they want to usurp power. Yes, at some point in time, it's going to max out on a global scale. And you'll have the enemy. But God says, look, you stand up for me. You be bold for me. Though 1,000 fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, you can do this. This is your chance to have the greatest revival that's happened. Yeah, God may do a little shaking of the tree, but that's for the harvest. That's for the people coming to the Lord. Right? God has plan A and plan B. Plan A is he blesses us and we turn to him out of gratefulness, but if that doesn't work, he does have plan B. He lets us have the results of our decisions and bad things happen, and then we turn to him out of desperation. His goal is to have us turn to him. And most people, right, they don't choose plan A, they wait around for plan B, and it's up to us to be there, to point them to Christ in their times of crisis. So anyway, this is a great time to be alive, and I think that there's a lot that the Lord wants to do before he returns, and you get to be a part of it. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end with that, and God bless you.
So does that make things a little clearer on what might be happening in the world today? It's so crystal clear the way William presents it, and helps us make sense of the chaos. Some of the things that come out for me is out of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 9. The thing that has been, it is that which we shall be, and that which is done, that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. So, all throughout history, we've seen this cycle over and over and over again. And what has made America great was that covenant relationship with God. And I think William did a great job of summing it up. We need to be pointing to people to Jesus now more than ever. And that we're here at this time to bring people to Jesus. So, with that, there's an encore on Sunday, so invite your friends. He's going to be back talking about a different subject, who the King of America really is. And so we welcome you then. He'll be back at the table signing books and answering questions. He's got a great heart and a sweet spirit. We'd also, if you're led to, there's opportunity for a free will offering to help cover some of his expenses, and I'm sure he would appreciate that. So now if you'll bow your hearts, we'll close in prayer. Dear Lord Jesus, we just thank you for tonight. We thank you for William. We thank you for the message that he's bringing to the world, that he's pointing people back to you. And we just ask for that boldness. We just ask that you would give us those opportunities to point people to you as we go through these times. We've gotten good information tonight to be able to do so. We ask your blessing on William as he continues his travels and goes around the country sharing your word and message. And we just ask your blessing on each one of us here tonight, that you would get us home safely, and that you would give us the opportunity to point people to you. And all God's people said together, amen.